of how this dynamic that you're seeing in Europe, where in a lot of these European countries like Austria, and I'll bring up some data from them a bit later, and some of the Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, in Italy, you're seeing this emergence of millennial nationalism, where young people who are kind of who associate with the right, and also you see it in France as well. They almost none of them support the conservative parties, the traditional center right parties. Only boomers vote for them, basically. Instead, that they want a kind of populist nationalist style that focuses on immigration rather than focusing on tax cuts. They want to kind of maybe be a bit more of a kind of a center kind of economic policy, because then basically millennials have been screwed by all of these processes, particularly immigration and how it's affecting them. And so it's far more difficult for them to buy their own home. It's far more difficult for them to get ahead because of the cost of living and so on. And so yeah, obviously Europe has some different elements, like the whole attitude towards sanctions on Russia and energy policy and everything there is quite different than how it is in Australia. But that basic difference between a kind of millennial nationalism, where a lot of these, he was kind of going through the stats, how all of these populist parties, their number one voter base is millennials, particularly millennial males, and how they're running a lot of younger candidates in a lot of these parties, that they're kind of tooling their image towards the young Gen X millennial type voter, as opposed to Australia, where our equivalent would be the One Nation Party, but the One Nation Party have this kind of stale boomer image. Everyone in the party is really old, has been around for decades. It has no, it's not fresh, it's not engaging. And then the rest of the right has this kind of stale boomer conservative mindset, as opposed to this popular style. And so it's kind of like this gap in Australian politics that he says in the article, more or less, and I agree, that kind of prophesying the rise of a kind of millennial, national populism in Australia as the obvious kind of untapped market in Australian politics. And I mentioned this the other night about how like the Greens and the far left is very good at tailoring its kind of politics to that younger demographic, where the right has been terrible at that so far. So it'll be interesting to see how someone eventually figures how in Australia people figure out how to like adjust, because you see this with the right wing media like Sky News. Only boomers watch Sky News. Only boomers read the old newspapers like the Daily Telegraph or something in New South Wales. I don't know what the equivalent would be in Victoria. But there's just, the right is just kind of running on fumes. These like legacy ways of approaching political media, legacy ways of approaching campaigns. And, what would be interesting is people like us
well, you
and
think
our politics.
you believe that white identity politics is inevitable. I think that's like your Twitter handle or something, right?
Yeah.
And that will be the fresh new right wing that you think is required in order for the right to make a resurgence, right?
Yeah, I think like we're obviously on the fringe, but I think if you look at what's been done in, so we're going to talk about Austria in a second, but if you look at the Freedom Party in Austria, they are the number one party according to the polls in Austria. They're polling at 29% nationally, which is a lot. No other party is getting that because they don't have like two major parties like us. They kind of have four major parties. So there's like a far left, a center right, and a far right kind of party. And but anyway, they're the dominant party, and they have policies not just about stopping immigration, but about remigration, about getting the migrants to go back with government programs that have already entered Austria. And they're surging in popularity, and they're a legacy party. They've been around, like there was like ex-Nazis basically that founded the party in like the 1950s, and they've been around since then, and they've had this kind of anti-immigration populism for decades. It's kind of gone through different kind of ebbs and flows of popularity. So it's like they just emerged out of nowhere, but they've never been as dominant of a force as popular of a force as they are right now. And that's very interesting. We also have seen in Denmark that, both, even the center left party is having to kind of go against immigration to win the vote, because the national conversation has been shifted by anti-immigration activism. We see similar things in Sweden, similar things in Finland. In Italy, the Brothers of Italy just got elected, who were originally founded by kind of neo-fascists, and they're very, like, the Brothers of Italy party have cucked a lot, and they've been getting a lot of criticism for their campaign was a lot more hardcore than their implementation. But the fact that that style of politics was so popular in Italy is a light pill, because it shows that there's a massive nationalist voter base in Italy, and we've seen also in France again, the kind of Marianne Le Pen and her political parties that she's been associated with are only growing and growing and growing in popularity. She is kind of cucking in many ways, and kind of what they call de-demonization. She's tried to kind of play down how far right they are, and kind of lurch to the center to become more electable. But nevertheless, that nationalist political style, massively popular in France. So you're seeing all across Europe, nationalism is rising in a kind of limited form. It's not like turbo based, hardcore, throwing Romans, denying the
It
Holocaust
also
type
it also
nationalism. But
faces a lot of suppression of government and social suppression as well, probably more than it ever has before. So can it be held down? I think time will tell. I don't think it can be, not indefinitely.
well, it's really, yeah. I don't think it can be held down. It just has to be dealt with now. Like the system in Europe has had to adapt and try and like provide a cucked version of nationalism to kind of hold everything together. That's the best negotiation. So when you can get the system to make these kinds of concessions, where Donald Trump kind of was like this in America. It's like now the Republican Party has to do fake nationalism rather than not even doing nationalism at all. Obviously, the fake nationalism still sucks, but it's a win that they're having to at least pretend to be nationalists. And so that's what I see developing in these European countries and in Australia, and where immigration can become more and more of a central issue in the political discourse. I mean, we went through the data already many shows back about how unpopular immigration is in Australia. It's universally disliked. I think only 7% or 6% of the respondents to this one poll that we were looking at said that they thought that Australia should have taken more migrants. And like I think 2/3 of the poll of the people who responded to the poll said that Australia should take much less migrants. So um, it's a very, like, leading on immigration is actually very popular. So it's not as though there isn't popularity there. It's just the organization to force that issue into the public conversation, to force it into the media, to um, force it into the kind of dynamic of what politicians are arguing about and answering for, and so on. And that's really the big problem in Australia. Is like the quality of the media is so bad. We don't have strong nationalist voices, or even like strong kind of right populist voices in the media. And so that's, I think, the first step. Once you can start developing something like that, then you can create a pressure. But also, I think this kind of thinking, this intergenerational thinking, people need to kind of come to terms with the fact on the right that this boomer conservatism dies with the boomers. It's not going to appeal to millennials who don't care about tax cuts for rich people, because none of them ever get into a wealthy enough position to benefit from that. They don't care about, the things that traditional conservatives cared about. They care about, how the hell am I going to own my own home? Why are you flooding my country with migrants? And other identity politics issues like
Why can't
the
I? Why can't
trans.
I? Why can't I visit my local supermarket without probably being set upon or abused as I walk in there by some ethnic gang on the way? Stuff like that, right? It's real
Yeah,
world problems.
or
It's real
they've got
world.
like a 4-year-old or 5-year-old kid, and they're, oh, I'm going to send it to a school where they're going to teach it, that there's 48 genders and how to dildo itself in grade 3. We don't want to send, we don't want that, right? So these kinds of like millennial issues are very amenable to identity politics, to culture war. Um, they're not amenable to traditional concerns of boomers, railing against like, oh, climate change is a hoax or this kind of nonsense. not. I mean, I agree that climate change is. I side with the boomer conservatives, generally speaking, on climate change, but that's just not really an issue that is anywhere near as important as the institutional right makes out. Um, so, so yeah, like this new political style that's emerging in Europe, we can look to Europe, which have very similar political systems to us. They're white people like us. They face similar problems, and we can say, well, if that's happening there, we can envisage in the next 10 years, as the economy continues to go down the toilet in Australia, um, a similar kind of politics emerging here, and this kind of like roadmap for replicating their political successes will increasingly, I think, become influential in Australia, because you can't look to American politics in Australia as well, because their system is very different. There's a far more rigid two-party system. They have primary voting for everything, um, and so you kind of like operating within the Republican Party a lot more in the American system to get it to on the right and trying to shift the party. Whereas in Australia, because you have a multi-party system, it doesn't make any sense to kind of replicate that entry strategy. It makes a lot more sense to uh, think about multiple parties on the right in like a coalition and how they pressurize each other and so on. So so anyway, I felt that it was a good article by Jordan Knight, and it's an interesting this dichotomy of boomer nationalism versus boomer conservatism versus millennial nationalism. I think this is really the key kind of dialectic on the right that needs to kind of be advanced going
Someone
forward.
here asks, where is our far right party? We don't have one. And that's right. Like Australia doesn't have a truly right wing party. I think it needs one, even if it's just to placate people to a certain degree. It needs someone to step up and take on that challenge of creating that kind of party. I suppose I tried it myself and didn't fly, but we didn't really make a strong effort, and we probably did it at the wrong time. It was too close to election time, and we didn't know what we were doing either. We were just young and impulsive. But maybe this could be something we could look at in the future. Personally, I'm not really interested in party politics, though. That's probably one of the reasons I didn't fly, because I took advice from somebody else. I'm like, what do you think we should do next? And someone said, we should start a political party. I'm like, all right. My heart wasn't really in it, though, you know. I'm more of a individual influencer. Like to stay as a peripheral figure if I can these days. But I skipped dinner tonight because I've had a busy day.